Okay. I think we can start. It's 11:55, and as we agreed, we will start promptly at 11:55. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important conversation. My name is Mirsad Kriještorac, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Broward College in Florida. And I'm also a research fellow at the Jaffa Center of the Muslim World Studies Center at the Florida International University. To contextualize today's conversation for those who might not be familiar with the Bosnian Srebrenica Genocide, I will provide a brief overview and the background of the story and then pass it on to today's moderators, Ms. Aida Mačkić and Ms. Aida Hughton. Following Bosnia's and Herzegovina's declaration of independence and its United Nations recognition in April of 1992, Bosnian Serb forces, supported by disjointed former Yugoslav army, led a campaign to seize territory and cleanse the country of its non-Serb civilians, leading to the death of more than 100,000 people over the next 3 years. During the ensuing war, planned, systematic, and widespread abuses with ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and other gross violations of human rights were committed primarily by Bosnian Serb forces against Bosniaks. In an effort to protect civilians, on April 16, 1993, the United Nations Security Council disarmed and declared the eastern Bosnian town of Srebrenica as a UN safe zone and promised to protect thousands of civilians and people from neighboring villages who found refuge there. To increase civilian protection, the United Nations then also made the neighboring town of Žepa as a safe zone as well. Yet, the United Nations failed to carry out its promise to protect the towns 2 years later when Serbian forces first overran Srebrenica UN safe zone, and then 2 weeks later, the neighboring Žepa UN safe zone as well, while the world watched and did nothing to stop them. As a result, the deadliest atrocity of the war occurred in and around Srebrenica after Bosnian Serb forces entered the UN-monitored refugee camp, separated men from women, and then for weeks proceeded to torture and kill more than 8,000 Bosniak boys and men in July of 1995. The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, established unanimously by the United Nations Security Council to investigate abuses and war crimes, twice ruled the horrific crime committed against Bosniaks in and around Srebrenica genocide and indicted the top Bosnian Serb leaders for it. The court and its ruling represents a major step forward in establishing the global human rights protection regime, as well as the affirmation of the global community never to allow crimes against humanity to be ignored and unpunished. In line with that commitment, the United States, Great Britain, European Union, and others have issued numerous declarations affirming the ruling on the Srebrenica genocide. However, despite that United Nations established international court rulings, independent reports, and broad international consensus on genocide, prominent Serb politicians, as well as various other foreign actors, have continued to deny that Serb forces committed genocide against Bosniaks in Srebrenica. That should not be ignored because researchers have pointed that the genocide denial is an indication of serious intent to further genocidal actions. This is especially threatening when it is done by the leaders and people in places where genocide was previously committed, as in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Bosniak genocide committed by Serbian troops in Srebrenica. Many of the survivors of the Srebrenica genocide now live with their families throughout the United States, Great Britain, European Union, and other countries around the world. And they are continuously being disturbed by the denial and open glorification of the convicted war criminals and others who were directly responsible for that genocide. Those actions further traumatize genocide survivors and their families, as well as all other people of good conscience. Now and again, the global community is not vocal nor active enough in denouncing those attempts of denial, and in that way, the situation is reminiscent of the failed promise to protect the UN declared safe zone in July of 1993, where now even the survivors are not being helped and protected as they should be. We must not be silent about it. Acknowledgement and public denouncements of the Srebrenica genocide denial by itself may not stop the worst genocide deniers and prevent future genocide, but the political will to prosecute those who were responsible and public acknowledgement of genocide could bring a chance for peace and reconciliation and closure for the victims, survivors, and their families. To raise awareness about this serious and dangerous situation of the traumatization caused by genocide denial, to empathize and witness on behalf of the victims and survivors, and to educate the public about the issue of Srebrenica genocide denial, the Global Human Rights Initiative project of the Social and Behavioral Sciences and Human Services at Broward College and the Florida International University's class on the International Protection of Human Rights, in partnership with several Bosnian organizations from the United States and Great Britain, together organized this public conversation with survivors and trauma experts, Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef. This event will be followed with a series of conversations about this topic in following few months. The conversation series is organized through partnerships of organizations BiH United, Jedna BiH, US Bosnian American Genocide Institute, Preporod of North America, Rembering Srebrenica UK, and Bosnia and Herzegovina UK network. We very much appreciate Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef for agreeing also to open this discussion with us. The next event in the series is going to be hosted by the organization BiH United to discuss the political dimension of Srebrenica genocide and the media's role in it. The event is planned for the next month, May of 23, and we will distribute information about this event shortly. Today's event is also co-sponsored by the FIU Mohsin and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies and the FIU Miami, Florida, Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence. So welcome to all of you who join us. And now we'll pass the baton to Aida Mačkić and Ms. Aida Hughton as they are going to moderate this event.
Thank you, Dr. Kriještorac. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Kriještorac and the Broward College Global Human Rights Initiative, as well as the FIU's International Protection for Human Rights class, who are jointly hosting us today to address this important issue of the Srebrenica genocide denial. We also want to express our appreciation to our partner organization, namely BAGI, which is the Bosnian American Genocide Institute, Preporod of North America, BiH United, Rembering Srebrenica UK, and Bosnia Network, as well as others who have uplifted this important series. Denying genocide is a grave injustice and is the final step in perpetuating harm against targeted groups of people. The Srebrenica Memorial Center has recently uncovered alarming evidence of a surge in denial of Srebrenica genocide across various social media platforms, which are frequently utilized to disseminate mass misinformation and disinformation to the public. It has become increasingly evident that this organized and concentrated effort of denial is the work of political actors from Southeast Europe and beyond. They seek to further their political goals, inflict additional harm, and impede reconciliation efforts and healing for victims in Bosnia. Now, sadly, survivors of the Srebrenica genocide and their families residing in the US and abroad are often left to grapple with this denial on their own. And this disturbing effort to deny the genocide and other crimes against humanity perpetrated against Bosniaks during the 90s has yet to receive the attention that it deserves. Today, we have assembled here to confront the painful memories of dark chapter in Bosnia's history and to do so with compassion and a wary of vulnerability of many of those who have survived. As we proceed through the speakers' sessions today, let us not forget that every number representing the victims of the genocide, which now stands at 8,372, it signifies an individual with a unique experience, an individual with dreams. It signifies an individual with aspirations and a future to look forward to that were mercilessly cut short by the war criminals. Each person was a parent, a sibling, a cousin, or a neighbor, a friend. These numbers represent entire families that were uprooted and lost, and their memory and legacy must be acknowledged and respected. So with that, I'd like us to take a moment of silence in their honor.
I would like to thank both Dr. Kriještorac and Aida for introduction. And I would just like to remind all the participants that they can actually ask questions and leave comments in Q&A section. We will try to answer as many as we can, but we also are fully aware that we may not be able to answer all of them. However, they will for sure help us shape other sessions of this series. So we thank you for that. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Azra Osmančević, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Mind Wealth Psychology in Ithaca, New York. She is originally from Bosnia and Herzegovina and was raised in Des Moines, Iowa, after immigrating to the United States as a refugee with her parents when she was a child. Dr. Osmančević values taking a collaborative, culturally responsive, and reflective approach to therapy. Her clinical and assessment expertise are also heavily informed by her research interests, which have focused on the influences of cultural factors on the experiences of trauma, healing, and cultural identity development among the Bosnian American diasporic population in the United States. Dr. Osmančević.
Thank you so much, Aida. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone. Thank you all so much for coming today and for welcoming me in this really important discussion. I know Aida gave a little introduction about me, but I'm just going to expand on that a little bit just so you can get to know me a little bit better. And then I'll spend just a few moments talking about my research briefly, and then spend a lot more time talking about PTSD and what that looks like among Bošnjaci and what it looks like among our people that were exposed to everything that Aida and everyone else has talked about today. Does that sound okay with everyone? Great. So also feel free to ask any questions along the way. I am super discussion based when it comes to these things, so it'll be an open conversation between all of us. So like Aida said, I'm a clinical psychologist. My name is Dr. Azra Osmančević. I'm originally from Sanski Most in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and my parents and I immigrated to the US as refugees in 1996 due to the Bosnian War. I was raised in Des Moines, Iowa, where I went to Iowa State University for my undergrad, and I earned my Ph.D. in clinical psychology at the University of South Dakota. I recently completed my residency at the New Mexico VA and Indian Health Services in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'm currently completing my postdoctoral fellowship in clinical psychology at a private practice here in New York. My clinical specialty focused specifically on trauma and multicultural and cultural identity issues. And if we think about my research broadly, throughout my career, it's really focused on the Bosnian American diaspora. And more recently, my dissertation has focused on experiences of cultural disconnectedness among Bosnian American diaspora ages 18 to 30. We use a phenomenological perspective in my dissertation where I interviewed 7 participants from various parts of the United States who identified as Bosnian American and who reported experiencing cultural disconnectedness. My research was conducted over the course of a year. So we began in summer 2021 and went all the way through summer 2022. So my participants and I were very heavily connected. And the research itself began in the fall of 2020. So this is many years of work and dedication to our people and to give back to my community. And that's why I am a clinical psychologist now, because of everything that has happened to the people that are in the room today and the other people that we've talked about, to my parents, to our ancestors. It's really important for me to do this work and to advocate for our people. So when I met with these participants on these multiple occasions, the majority of them identified as Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims. And this will be a really important part of our discussion today with regard to genocide denial. But in this study, I explored Bosnian American diaspora's challenges with balancing their native Bosnian cultures and their host American cultures and the impacts that this had on their psychological well-being. And if we think about cultural disconnectedness broadly, it's a universal experience that many immigrant and refugee groups go through. And for our population specifically, I conceptualized it as feeling too Bosnian for Americans and too American for Bosnians. And so broadly, the findings here of my research among these 7 participants comprised of 9 major themes. And so I won't go into major details about what this was, but the things that influence people's experiences of cultural disconnectedness had to do with identifying as Muslim, and how this can cause cultural disconnectedness for them, language abilities, how culture can become either a risk or a protective factor against cultural disconnectedness, different ways that Bosnian American diaspora engaged in support seeking to manage and navigate those experiences of cultural disconnectedness, and the acceptance that came from these experiences and how they have learned to accept and navigate how some days they do feel disconnected and other days they don't. And we focused heavily on the role that family plays for Bosnian American diaspora between those age groups that I told you about, and how this can cause either experiences of connectedness or disconnectedness. And every single one of my participants talked about this idea of feeling either too Bosnian or too American. And interestingly enough, a few other things that came up were race and how this is a multi-dimensional factor among Bosnian American diaspora between the ages of 18 to 30, and how it can cause either connectedness or disconnectedness for them. And lastly, community was heavily emphasized. And so we talked about how community members, the Bosnian American community, can cause either experiences of connectedness or disconnectedness. And when we look at psychological well-being broadly, what people talked about in my study and what was found were a wide range of emotions and behaviors related to these experiences of cultural disconnectedness. They reported experiences of sadness, anger, frustration, defensiveness, pride, avoidance, hiding their Bosnian culture, and desires for cultural connectedness. These findings really underscore just how difficult and different it is for Bosnian American diaspora to balance these two cultures and the different consequences that come from this. And so given my research and my clinical expertise, it's really imperative that we focus on genocide denial together, as this traumatic experience really heavily informs the impacts of Bosnian diaspora, especially the children of parents who were exposed to the Bosnian War, me being one of them, which is my main research focus. And Bosniak trauma was heavily researched in like the late 1990s to mid 2000s, but then we saw a really big drop in how much people did focus on our community. And my research and my clinical work, I'm very dedicated to bringing awareness back into the research world, into academia, and into our communities about what we can do. And this talk is one of the first steps into, I think, really approaching something that is very heavily traumatic for our population. And so like was said earlier, the Bosnian War was among one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history since World War II, and it consisted of things like ethnic cleansing, genocidal campaigns, prolonged sieges, massive destruction of the country's infrastructure, and numerous other traumatic events that involved pre-flight, flight, and exile and resettlement periods among our people. And this war left a very long-standing mark on our community and their descendants, primarily various forms of psychological impacts among both adults and children. And so we see things like psychological distress, depression, anxiety, acculturative stress, and post-traumatic stress disorder. For today's talk, I'm going to spend more time talking about PTSD broadly and complex PTSD and what that looks like among Bosniaks, specifically with regard to genocide denial. So I don't want to go too broad, but I want to really zoom into what this looks like. And I welcome any questions like once I'm done talking about this stuff too. So Bosniak trauma specifically can be either viewed as PTSD or complex PTSD. And generally, when we think about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the event as it has occurred to others, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the events. So repeated exposure to chronic stress related to the event, such as multiple instances of rape, issues with hunger, death, disruptive moves, collecting human remains, genocide denial. I see that I have 3 minutes here, and so I'll talk about this a little bit quicker. But if we think about PTSD broadly, we have an umbrella of certain symptoms that come up for people. And one of the most important ones that I actually want to focus on here is avoidance. And so avoidance, among the other symptoms that we see, like re-experiencing flashbacks, negative alterations in cognition and mood and arousal symptoms, avoidance is what keeps our trauma alive. And if we think about complex PTSD, this is when people have the symptoms that I described above, but it has a variety of trauma that's happened. So things like childhood abuse, neglect, abandonment, ongoing exposure to violence or abuse, repeatedly witnessing it, being forced or manipulated into different acts, being tortured, kidnapped, or experiencing slavery, or being a prisoner of war, disruptive moves, and genocide denial falls underneath this umbrella of complex trauma. And many of the Bosniaks on this call today may have identified with some of the things here that I talked about. And what's really important here is that we approach and address this trauma together as Bošnjaci. Like I said, avoidance is one of the main symptoms of PTSD, and it's the primary thing that keeps our trauma alive and keeps us suffering, not just the people who were directly exposed, but the children and the descendants and everyone else related to this event. So anyone that has a connection to it, avoidance is what keeps this alive. And in today's talk, I really hope that we can learn from each other and process and approach some of these topics because this is one of the first steps towards healing. And I hope that we can do that all together. And I know that was really rushed, but if you have any questions, I'm willing to field those now. As you can see, I'm very passionate about this topic.
Thank you, Dr. Osmančević. That was wonderfully stated and very detailed. And I'm looking forward to really digging deeper into some of these questions and how it pertains to our lived experience as well. With that, I would love to introduce Dr. Omar Shareef. Dr. Omar Shareef is an MD, MBA, dual degree graduate of St. George's University School of Medicine. He completed residency at Nassau University Medical Center and completed a fellowship in public psychiatry and psychodynamic psychotherapy at Columbia University. Now, that was an impressive title. He currently practices at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, New York. So we have a couple New Yorkers here. Dr. Omar is a certified adult mental health first aid instructor, a community educator with Family and Youth Institute, and is a member of the HEAL Collective, which is a New York-based nonprofit dedicated to Muslims' mental health. Dr. Omar Shareef.
Thank you so much, Aida, for the lovely introduction. And I also want to give a very special thank you to Dr. Mirsad in particular. I would not be here on this panel and wouldn't be joining for this event had it not been for Dr. Mirsad connecting me to this and giving me resources actually to help in preparing for this incredibly heavy, but very, very critical topic to discuss. And I also want to thank my co-panelists for their insight, especially Dr. Azra with that excellent insight into PTSD and complex PTSD and the manifestations of trauma for the Bosniak people. I want to give one last shout out, and that is to Dr. Naila Husmanović, who gave me a lot of support and help in contextualizing and getting a lot of the more cultural nuances in discussing this particular topic. Notably, I am the one non-Bosniak here on the panel. And so for me, the conversation really centers around how universal the impact is of collective trauma, pain, generational trauma, genocide, and of course, the lingering effects that we see when trauma is not just individual based, but community based, and then even on top of that, nationally based. So when discussing this particular topic, the way I like to frame it, because it's very difficult to encapsulate just how heavy and complicated the effects are. And that, on top of that, when it comes to psychological symptoms, it manifests differently for everyone. So everyone presents differently for it. That's why it's hard to sort of pinpoint. A lot of people listening would probably say, well, for my family members or in my family, it didn't look that way. And for other people, they'll say, no, actually, our symptoms were much, much worse than what you're describing. We actually find it to be a lot more difficult than that. And then there are some who will say, I don't feel anything at all. For me, actually, my psychological defense was to completely block it out. I actually don't even recognize that this is something that may have happened, because for me, that's how I can cope with it. So all of us have different means and mechanisms for how we cope. And these coping mechanisms and defenses can often present in ways that are positive and helpful, but can also present in ways that are very negative and harmful, to us. And one of the most important ones that Dr. Mirsad in particular emphasized is the denial of trauma. And this is something that I think is central to this particular conversation, because ultimately, what Dr. Azra mentioned, one of the most important factors in pain and trauma persisting and continuing is the inability to actually confront it, work through it, and overcome it. And if you're unable to do this, then that scar remains and actually only deepens. And unfortunately, and this is something that we're seeing now with the next generation, when you have the children of victims, those children now have a genetic and generational impact of that trauma on them. Even without having been there or witnessed it themselves, the effect alone of what their parents experienced and the inability of their parents to confront and overcome means that their children now suffer the same. Many of the symptoms persist. Many of the children of victims often suffer from identity crises, from cultural crises, from acculturation crises, like Dr. Azra mentioned. A lot of times there's this feeling that you're not Bosnian enough for Bosnia, but then you're too Bosnian for America. And so you fit in neither. And so you have the children of survivors, the children of immigrants, unable to find purpose or place for themselves. And this leads to an identity crisis, which makes them particularly vulnerable when denialism happens, or when they're confronted with denialism. It hits that much deeper, because then there's a questioning of whether or not the trauma even happened, or whether or not the trauma is even real, whether or not my identity even is rooted in this or not rooted in this. There is this confusion, role confusion, that we often see. And the role confusion, in addition to denialism, persists in this pain, persists in this trauma. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Give me a heads up and let me know if everyone can see what I have up. Fantastic. So this is the best way that I'm going to try and frame it for everyone, which is, this is how complicated all of this is. And I'm going to describe it from 4 separate angles. So picture, if you can, each and every one of us being a circle, and every single one of us has a different shaped circle, because all of us have perceived our trauma and our experiences differently. So the most important thing that I'm going to emphasize here is our circle is split into 4 pieces of what makes us holistically us. And the first piece you see up there is biological and physical. So this is something that Dr. Azra mentioned that I want to emphasize, which is for a lot of people listening, they would think to themselves, well, okay, maybe the trauma occurred, but I don't actually physically feel this trauma. It's not physically felt. And yet for others, the trauma doesn't feel psychological. The trauma feels very physical. And what we mean by this is a term that we use called psychosomatic, somatic symptoms in particular. When we talk about somatic symptoms, the best way to sort of describe it is this is something that originates in the mind. It originates psychologically. In this case, the trauma of genocide, the trauma of cleansing, ethnic cleansing, being rooted inside someone, and then the trauma manifesting physically. So in this case, what we mean by this in terms of physical symptoms is you would have symptoms of body aches and pains, you have symptoms of headaches, you would have symptoms of chest pain, you have symptoms of difficulty breathing, shortness of breath, anxiety symptoms, symptoms of PTSD, where you'd have recurring nightmares, hypervigilant responses, avoidance responses, and you're unable to pinpoint why you feel this way or where these symptoms are coming from. You would take Tylenol, you would take like painkillers, but the pain doesn't actually go away. The nightmares don't stop. The symptoms persist. These are physical, biological and physical symptoms of trauma that someone experiences. Next, when you move towards psychological, you'll see the second part of the circle there. This is symptoms of persistent trauma that now manifest psychologically in terms of our cognition, perception, attitude, personality, behavior. And like Dr. Azra mentioned, the impact of psychological trauma is not, it only happens in that one moment. In the moment of the genocide or in like the days or the weeks following the genocide, research shows that this particular trauma on this massive a scale is something that persists for decades. Decades you will have the effect of this. And for some people, and this is heartbreaking to admit, but for many, many Bosnian victims, oftentimes the symptoms will never remit. This will be a lifelong struggle that they will have. And so the psychological symptoms, as we described, would be symptoms of PTSD, complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, for some, even psychosis that you would experience, paranoia. These are persistent symptoms that you would see psychologically, and then the coping mechanisms for it. And this is something that a lot of victims can attest to are, for many people, sometimes coping mechanisms themselves become their own illness. For example, self-medicating with substances and developing addictions to numb pain or drown out pain. Oftentimes it can result in lashing out in anger towards family members, anger towards your spouse. Domestic violence incidents can often be a result of unresolved trauma psychologically. And this is where we talk about the generational component, where parents who are victims themselves struggling to come to terms with what has been afflicted upon them, finding difficulty emotionally connecting or finding difficulty processing emotions with their children. And so this is the generational effect that we see psychologically. The next part of the circle is social. Social pertains to how a people collectively cope and individually cope with their trauma. And oftentimes what we would see in a lot of folks who are victims of trauma is there's a collective sharing of trauma, because individually it is far too crushing a burden to take on individually. One individual, Bosnian or Bosniak, cannot bear the crushing weight of what has happened, the size, scale, and scope of an entire organized campaign of ethnic cleansing against you and your people. It is impossible for one to experience this and bear this burden alone. And so there's a collective processing. What we see is there's a collective level of it and then an individual level of it. So you'll see multiple layers of it. An individual trying to process their own individual trauma, like Aida mentioned, the loss of a family member, the loss of a loved one, pain or torture inflicted upon the self, the disruption or destruction of family or the sense of home or a homeland or a sense of identity. And then the familial level next to that, which is a family coping with a collective trauma. Then beyond that, a community level, coming from a certain town or coming from a certain background or having a certain sub-ethnicity. And then beyond that, we have national, like on a national scale, just collectively, just as a people. So now you have 4 to 5 different levels of trauma, socially speaking, and each level has a different way of coping with it. And so this is how complicated this sort of topic is, socially speaking. A core component of taking care of our mental health is being able to share and find a collective sense of that trauma. So a critical component of this is when it comes to denialism or denying a genocide or denying a trauma, there is potency in people coming together and unifying in a central vision that we've all collectively experienced something. We validate one another in our collective trauma and in the experiences that we have. That validation can be individual, it can be familial, it can be community, and it can be also nationally. All levels, you can have that. It's an important thing to have that kind of unity. The next level is going to be spiritual. This is what I will conclude with, which is a very, very heavy component of what happened in terms of the ethnic cleansing was that there was a spiritual component to the cleansing, specifically targeting spiritualism, specifically targeting faith-based, specifically targeting Muslims. And so what you see is there's a physical component to that trauma, there's a psychological component to that trauma, there's a social component to that trauma, but you cannot ignore the spiritual component, the destruction of a people spiritually. This is not inflicting pain upon the body or pain upon the mind or pain upon a family or a social structure. This is inflicting pain upon a soul, upon someone's spirit. And so part of the campaign to ethnically cleanse and commit genocide is to break a people spiritually, to break a people's ability to cope, because the power of spiritualism is that it can overcome the other three, that with faith alone, you can work through and build through a trauma through faith. That's the potency of faith. And so if you break someone's faith, you break their ability to then, you remove a coping mechanism that they have with their ability to overcome a particular trauma. So the spiritual dimension is a powerful one, and it can be a double-edged sword for a lot of people, often leaning into religion and having a very strong Islamic identity can be something that's potent and powerful for them. For others, it's a distancing from that because of my Muslim identity, specifically because I was Muslim, this pain was inflicted upon me and my family. And so I distanced myself from it in order to help myself heal from that. So you'll see the two extremes, one in which a family or an individual may lean very heavily into faith as a protective mechanism, and those who shift away from their spiritualism also as a protective mechanism. Either way, it's still the loss of a mechanism for the individual and for collective people. And so you'll see a crisis of faith, a crisis of spiritualism in victims and in their families and in their children, where they're unsure of where they stand or how to express what they're experiencing. So the most important thing I'm going to end with is for anyone listening, or anyone who has connection to a victim, or anyone who has connection to a family that is suffering from this, the most important thing above all else, Dr. Azra mentioned this in particular, and it's a core piece of what I'm going to describe, is no matter where your wound is, whether it's a physical somatic wound of trauma, a psychological wound, a social wound with death or loss in a family, or a collective pain that a family or community is feeling, or even spiritually, if your wound is there, doesn't matter where it is that your pain is, the most important thing is, one, recognizing that pain, not giving into a denialism and denying your own pain, and two, seeking help and support for it. Help and support comes in many different shapes and forms. What I would recommend, what Dr. Azra recommends, just as clinical professionals, we will always push and recommend that you seek professional care for this. And what that means is like getting set up with a psychologist, with a therapist, with a counselor, with a psychiatrist if needed, if medications may be necessary for some of these clinical conditions. But the most important thing is to help yourself heal from this. And healing is very difficult to do alone. Very difficult to do alone. It's something that we strongly suggest you connect yourself to professionals, or connect yourself to healing groups, connect yourself to those who can help guide you through this process. So that's the last thing that I would end with is beseeching everyone listening to please connect yourself to care, connect yourself to professionals who can help you. And if you need more culturally competent care, this is where Dr. Azra is present. This is where Dr. Naila Hustanović is present. You will have those of Bosnian identity who are also clinical professionals. I can give you the best of both.
Yeah, we're going to address that in the rest of the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Shareef.
Thank you, Dr. Ruz. My apologies for going a little over time.
We're good on time. With that, I want to again thank you, Dr. Shareef. That was very important, and I love the visual concept of it. It actually it awakened some things that I wasn't aware of, and how they all together come and really identify certain levels of trauma, whether that is, like you said, physical, spiritual, and that each individual still may be experiencing it on a different level. With that, I would love to introduce Senada Cvrk-Pargan. Ms. Senada is an author, an activist. She was born in Srebrenica in 1975. She's a survivor of the Srebrenica genocide and lived in the region while it was under siege from 1992 to 95. She has lost 99 family members, including her 4 uncles during the genocide. Her mission is to spread the truth and raise awareness about the genocide against Bosniaks, which are Bosnian Muslims, in Srebrenica, and to fight the denial of genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She is currently the president of the Bosniak cultural community, Preporod of North America, and the author of a book called A Sorrow for Silence, and a book called The Darkness of Silver Lights. With that, Senada, please take the floor.
Well, hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all of you organizers and participants in today's great event. Also, I would like say hello to all Muslim brothers and sisters throughout the world, and wish them Mubarak Ramadan. Yes, I am very happy to be here today to talk about my experiences that I went through, and I have to admit that I will be talking about some things for the first time publicly. So when Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef were talking, I related to both of their topics, and I am the one who also was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorders years ago. I also have some experiences with medications that helped me get through this, through some obstacles that I was facing back in time. Thanks to Allah, I'm good now. So I am a war survivor. My best years and adulthood got lost during the war. From 1992 to 1995, I was only 17 when everything started, when my house was burned on April 12th of 1922. That's where the first fear faced my young age. So going through the war was just something that is very broad, and I would need like few days to tell everyone. So I will be quick and short, but I have to tell you that seeing killed people, seeing raped people, seeing wounded people, of course, is something that will stuck with us as a wound psychologically and mentally, and will never be forgotten. So losing a lot of family members, as you said, Dr. Aida, I lost 99 family members from mom's side and dad's side. And then I lost 4 uncles. My father had 4 brothers, they're all killed, and my father saw them being killed. Also, I lost 3 first cousins, and now I am raising 2 beautiful children. They're grown-ups, college students, and I'm a very proud mom. I am talking to them about everything that happened there, but the pain that I am experiencing is that my children will never meet my uncles. It is traumatic. I have to admit that I still have dreams about, I would rather say nightmares. I had one last night, so that tells me that I still have some things that are not cured. And I'm pretty sure that Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef would agree with me that these pain will stay with all of our us survivors of genocide. It doesn't matter is a genocide in Srebrenica or anywhere else. So I believe in God, and I figured that there was a reason for me to survive among all others who lost their innocent lives during the genocide in Srebrenica. So I took a path to fight against the genocide denial, which is the last stage of genocide. And I had the opportunity to talk to the leaders of this country in US State Department recently about how I look at that. And as a citizen of United States, I had the right to complain and say what I think. I was really surprised that they took approach the way they did. They listened, they knew, they are willing to help us Srebrenica genocide survivors feel comfortable. And that kind of gave me the hope that genocide denial somehow will be stopped by authorities of this country. On the other hand, I'm a family person. I am a mother. I have 2 children. I'm a married person, and I raise 2 amazing kids. My children read a lot. They know Bosnian language, and they read, they listen, they talk about it. And me, being a war survivor, I was able to tell them specific things, the truth, the facts of what actually was happening. But what I'm finding is that some of the books that they're approaching to are not telling the truth. So I would like to ask questions about how to teach our children to not misunderstand the history, how to approach to our children. Again, my children are grown up and they know, they go to Bosnia, they see by themselves what happened, and they know what I've been through. They see the graves in Potocari Memorial Center in Potocari, and they know the truth. But the question is, how do we relate to the truth when we hear something else from a different books, and they read the books somewhere online or whatever, when their mom is a war survivor and I'm coming with the truth. So maybe one of you, Dr. Shareef or Dr. Osmančević, could talk about this topic today. And also I would like to know and maybe spread the information to other parents whose children are younger and they are raising them the way I did my kids, how to talk to our kids without composing the hate for those who committed the genocide. Thanks to God, I was able to somehow establish my children in a positive way, not to hate, but to be careful, to listen, but not to trust. So, meaning not to trust everything that they hear from somebody who is trying to miscommunicate the history that we've been through. So that would be my first question for either one of you who would be able to maybe give us a quick answer and maybe help other parents raise their children in a proper way and getting the history under the control. Thank you.
Are we fielding questions right now or saving them for later?
I think yeah, let's address some of them, especially because you have an hour limitation. So I would love for especially our survivors to be able to address you with their questions, if that's all right with you.
Definitely. I think that's a wonderful question, Senada, and thank you so much for sharing and for being so open and willing to tell your story. I think that's one of the most important things when it comes to healing. And what you've done sounds like it's been very effective with teaching them about the history. One thing that I remember that my parents taught me is to never forget what happened. And you don't have to stoop down to that level of hatred and pushing people away. And I think the more that we can think about our values and how to align those together, especially when it comes to like the trauma that you've experienced, one of the first ways to be able to effectively, I think, raise children and to help other people is to help yourself and to heal yourself as much as you can before you take on that massive role of molding a child's mind, especially when it comes to things like this, which are very complex and difficult. And it sounds like you did do that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add something that is very important. When I talked to psychologists years ago, I was told to face my fears the best way I know. That's how I started writing. So both of my books are written by emotion. True stories is behind every poem that I wrote in my both books. So I was able to express my feelings that way. Maybe some other war survivors will find a way to do the same, maybe by writing, maybe by talking, maybe by singing, maybe just, I don't know. So that was my way, and it really helped.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example about how healing looks different for different people, and healing will look different at different times of your life. So some periods it may be writing, other periods it may be connecting and talking to a professional for help, and other times it may be teaching people and advocating for your community. That's also a form of healing. And so I think the more creative we can be with how we approach these very important issues, like Dr. Shareef said, typically don't go away. Like that wound that you have in your heart, that grief and that loss, something I like to tell my patients is it'll always be there. Some days it'll feel deeper and bigger, and other days it'll feel smaller. And the more that we can do to approach these issues and not avoid them will help us through our healing journey. And so I think you're doing a great job, and you can definitely provide advice for people about how to raise their children. So thank you so much for that question.
If I may, since we started that, so should we talk to our children about this, or should we not talk about the horrors that we have maybe witnessed or so? Should we talk to the children or not?
That's a wonderful question. And coming from, I hold biases as being a child of someone who was exposed to war and all the trauma, both of my parents. And from my research and my clinical expertise, I think an approach would be better than avoidance, because like I said when I started, avoidance is what keeps the trauma alive. And so when it comes to figuring out how to do that and when to do that, being developmentally appropriate in your approach is very important. And so if your child is young and doesn't understand or cannot conceptualize death at this point, then teaching your child in a different way, and then developmentally when they are ready for more of that information, bringing that into the conversation. And so really being mindful about your audience, development, age, appropriate information, and delivery of that information effectively. And so if you want to deliver that information in a way that doesn't spew or add to hatred, I think that really practicing with yourself, like, how will I communicate this? Because that's also a form of healing. So definitely approach, but be developmentally appropriate when you do give this information to people.
And what's your advice, both of you? What's your advice for our youngsters? Should they be asking parents, or should the young? So parents saw it. What about children, right? So sometimes you approach your children and they don't want to hear it, or children can actually initiate the conversation. Should they? Or because there is, as you already know, there is that notion in our community that somehow if we don't talk about it, it's better. So our kids don't have to be bothered by that. And so we have experienced the same in the World War II, and our parents didn't tell us, and now we are experiencing it again. So should the kids also initiate the conversation?
I think we're in a completely different time period now with children. They have access to social media, the internet. They will learn this stuff whether or not you tell them, and they will be curious. And I think the more that you can approach this, like I said, will be effective. And so one thing that I remember that's been very important for me is that my parents were open and talked about it. There is stigma within our culture, 100%. There's stigma related to mental health, help and support. There's stigma with talking about the effects. And I think that just shows where people are at in their healing journey and if they're ready. And if you're a parent and you feel like you're ready to have those conversations with your children, then yes, you can do that. If you're not ready, maybe spend some time working and healing on yourself, right? Before you do that very important conversation with your child. But I think the more that you can validate and affirm and normalize these questions with your child, the better it'll be. So that's from my professional opinion, and I'll let Dr. Shareef also speak on that as well, because I don't want to take too much mic time.
I mean, Dr. Azra, there really isn't much to add to that. I think you pretty much cover all of it. What I will say is to Sister Senada that you're already doing it. The fact that you're even having the conversation alone is exactly where we should start with it. And Dr. Mirsad's question about whether you should or shouldn't even have this conversation, I would even go so far as to argue that it is a micro version of denialism to not even have this conversation at all. I'm just going to emphasize what Dr. Azra mentioned, which is that there are different developmental stages for your children, and it's important to make sure that you do not give traumatic information at a stage in which your child may not be equipped to handle this. So that's one thing I will say, which is very important, that if your child really truly cannot comprehend or grasp the gravity or weight of this, it actually may be re-traumatizing for them to hear explicit detail at a certain age when they may not be developmentally able to process all of it, versus when your child is a little bit older and the details can be given a bit more and they're able to work through it, then absolutely you certainly can then, but I would say gauge it based on that. If you don't know the gauge or you're unsure of how to do this, then what I would recommend, it's the same advice I gave for my previous section prior to the Q&A, which is have a professional do it for you. Have a professional do it for you. It's important to, at least what I would recommend is to talk to a therapist or a counselor, unload everything, all the trauma you've experienced, and then with that therapist request, do you mind, could we do a family therapy session where maybe the information comes from you and I'm present for it versus it coming from me? Or maybe, example, you coach me and tell me how to do it and what to say, what details I should sort of leave to the side, what details I should emphasize, what is something that is positive and constructive and supportive, and what feels negative and that I should leave out. That I don't want the information of this trauma to be destructive towards my child or lead them to have negative ways of coping with it. I want to make it that it's a positive experience for them, that you can take pain, trauma, hurt on this level and craft it into something beautiful and strengthening and resilient. That's the goal in mind. That's the whole point and purpose of even talking to your kids about this, is the building of resiliency, of strength, of being able to handle this information and handle whatever else life may throw at your kids. So what I would say is seek a professional's help if you need to mitigate this kind of conversation. If your child has already been exposed to something and is struggling with their ability to cope with it, then even more so, make sure to get them to a child psychologist or a child therapist and have them process this particular trauma. Unprocessed trauma will manifest in a lot of different ways for children. Often you'll see that kids will act out. Oftentimes you'll see kids internalize. Oftentimes you'll see kids say things or speak things that you would think to yourself, how do you even know this? Or where are you coming up with this? A lot of children who are more like preteen and teens will then seek their own information sources to either verify or learn more. The important thing that I would emphasize is that you don't want your kid going on like forums or going on TikTok or whatever to learn about genocide and trauma. This isn't an appropriate place to learn this. And we don't really know what it is that they will learn or who they're getting their information from. So it's important to make sure that when you're talking to your child about a significant and severe trauma, that you do it in a place in which you know that there's an emotional resonance for it, that they're at a certain stage of development in which they can handle it, in which you have a professional present who's able to help mitigate your own particular trauma and how you communicate that trauma and how that trauma manifests and how your child is processing and understanding this particular trauma. So it's very layered with this whole thing. Those are my 2 cents on this. And I do want to give my heart just to Sister Senada for how you've done it, the artistic way in which you've been able to sort of bridge this collective pain with you and your kids. Thank you for sharing that.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm sure that our participants and all those who will see this program later will be able to learn a lot, both from individual approaches as well as professional ones. So thank you all so much. Please allow me to introduce Senahid Haliliović, who was born in 1972 in village of Srebrenica in municipality of Srebrenica. He finished his primary education there. He lived there during the entire siege of Srebrenica, so from 1993 until July 95, when the city was overrun by the Serbian forces, which proceeded to commit a genocide against the Bosniaks, the town's native Muslim population. Senahid survived by walking over 60 miles through the front lines and Serbian troops held territory. After surviving this trauma, he lived in the city of Tuzla, where he obtained his BA degree in chemical engineering. He immigrated to the USA in 2002, where he acquired a master's degree in chemistry at the City College of New York. Senahid now lives in New York City with his wife and 3 children. He is currently a lecturer at chemistry and the CLT at the City University of New York. Senahid also authored a Bosnian language book called Jedna BiH Srebrenica, in which he described the fate and history of his city of Srebrenica. The second edition of this book was published in English under the title The Fate of Srebrenica. As a survivor of that genocide, Senahid wants to continue writing books and to talk and educate the public about the horrors of genocide. Senahid.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my experience about genocide in Srebrenica. And thank you for organize this panel. And also thank everyone who is watching and listening. As a survivor of genocide in Srebrenica, I am wondering and I'm asking questions always myself and other people. A lot of questions I already answered or some questions definitely I never got answered. Firstly, I have to mention and to say that genocide declared and recognized in Srebrenica, but at least 10 cities and 10 communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina also was committed genocide. Difference between Srebrenica and other places to me is because in Srebrenica, 8,372 persons killed in 7 days. But in another cities, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people killed in 5, 6 months. That is different. For example, I wish to stay, and I know when I was in Srebrenica, that was a surrounded city, every day grenaded, and every day people were killed. And I know by data that just in Srebrenica, before then July 11, 1995, were killed 3,166 persons. Children, women, older people, and also some used to be soldiers, but mostly civilians. The same fate was in Visegrad, in Vlasenica, Zvornik, Bijeljina, Brčko, all Podrinje, that area, Eastern Bosnia, and in Western Bosnia also we have some cities like Sanski Most and Prijedor that happened the same thing. And according to the definition of genocide, genocide not happen, it is committed in Sarajevo too. Because imagine that someone keep people surrounded without food, without electricity, every day grenading, every day killing people, and never know who is going to be next. Because in that time, that wasn't life to me. That was just waiting who will be next. And I don't know right now, definitely I am wake up and I am sleeping with that fact that genocide committed. But problem is after that denying of genocide. So denial of genocide, it is is not something new. Denial of genocide is from in previous wars, and just depends who is on control and who is controlling media. And I know that this misrepresentation during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina was definitely too much against Bosnia and against Bosniaks. I know in Srebrenica, when I used to be in Srebrenica, I heard in radio that people say that in Srebrenica coming, for example, 100 tons of humanitarian aid, but not income. So that was misrepresentation. And let's say, and the roots are not just from yesterday. So let's say if we look at the territory of former Yugoslavia, but according to the statistical data, 1,700,000 people killed. And to be honest, people killed between each nations, because the fascists, Eastern fascist Chetniks, who are trying to create Great Serbia, they kill Bosniaks and Croats. And Ustašas, they kill Serbs. So that fact somehow is hidden, because the partisans who are used to be real anti-fascists, they didn't allow us to talk about too much. I mean, they didn't hide that things, but they didn't allow to write about, especially on Bosniaks, Muslims. But the same fate, previous generation in Bosnia had the same experience as we had. In previous war, for example, Second War, in Podrinje, in whole Bosnia were killed 110,000 Bosniaks, more than in this war. And that data was hidden somehow, and nobody talk about that. So that means, and that machinery, how to hide facts, is the same today. Is the same today. So I can understand that somehow I could understand that someone surround cities, kill people, and it is that is without any emotion killing people. But I cannot understand that the dead people not give peace. After genocide in Srebrenica, in mass graves, they are always dug. So now we can find someone in 2, 3, 4, 5 mass graves, because bones hidden, and they bring it from one location to another location. So what is that? That is something what I cannot understand definitely, but I could say that denying genocide is putting salt in the wound of the surviving members of the family. It is humiliation of all well-intentional and honest people. It is the, I mean, it is irritation definitely of families, of relatives, and it is killing the moral and will to live every normal being, especially that is surviving victims. It is simply the last stage of carrying the genocide, and ultimately it is preparation for new one. Now, I would say that is, for example, in Podrinje, where I am from Srebrenica, that is one city in Podrinje. Muslims, I mean Bosniaks, used to be majority. 250,000 people expelled or killed. I mean 23,000 people killed before then Srebrenica genocide happened. No one is left to live over there in 1995. And it is not declaring genocide. That is what I cannot understand. And that is what I always ask another people and another. But let's go back and let's talk about consequences of genocide. And let's talk how I feel about. So after genocide happened, I lost 3 brothers and father. And I lost a lot of relatives, first and second relatives. Definitely, I never count them. When I try to count them, I stop maybe on 35, 40, and I can something disturb. And some force don't give me to. My mother one time told me, "Oh, my son, you lost 70 relatives." So I try to escape as much as possible trauma. So what I did, I keep myself busy, and I saw that is helped me. I don't know now if I'm traumatized. I never visited a doctor, but always I'm telling you, in my mind, this genocide when I'm sleeping, when I wake up, and ordering my Srebrenica, my relatives, my brothers, I'm dreaming them. But if I am deeply start to think about, or if I see that it is disturbing me, I keep myself busy. And that is results. But I know a lot of people, they are mentally ill. Some people hide that. And I know a lot of people that are definitely, it is very difficult to live with that. That's why my question is for Dr. Osmančević and MD Shareef. How is deal with that? When you every day, you know that something happened, and you know that injustice in totally for years, not only 1 year, killing in one stage, and another stage is hiding bones of relatives, and you always waiting. You will find it or not find, or if you find, for example, can you imagine that when committee or when they are who are trying to find people come one day to your day and tell, oh, we find only one wrist or one leg of your brother or your father. How do you feel? You have possibility to bear it or wait until we find something else, but nothing in guarantee that we will find. Yeah, yes. And let's say you say, okay, I'm going to bear it. And that's people do it. You bear it in Potocari. After 2 years, they come again and they say, oh, we find now another bond. But first bond we find in Zvornik, another one we find in Srebrenica, etc., etc. So that is definitely extending of genocide. Extending of genocide. And my question is, how to deal with it? How to live? How to escape? How to stop denial of genocide? Is there any way? Because denial of genocide is not anymore historical fact. It is not historical or constitutional framework. Now it is moving to the scientific field, especially medicine and psychology. So please, Dr. Osmančević and MD Shareef, please, can you answer this question?
Thank you so much for sharing, Senahid. I really appreciate your perspective and insight and story. And your question is short, but very complex. And the approach to this is going to look different for different people. And I think Dr. Shareef did a really good job earlier on in the talk talking about seeking professional support to manage and navigate these symptoms that for most people don't go away. And the reason why it's so hard for us and for you and for other Bosniaks is because you're consistently re-traumatized. They call you 2 years later and they tell you, oh, we found this part of your loved one or this part and that part. And I think that goes to show just how complex this trauma is. It doesn't just go from that one event that you experienced in that moment of time. It's something that keeps coming back up and up and up again. And people have different coping mechanisms and ways to deal with this. So you mentioned that you like to stay busy. And this can be effective and this can be helpful. And sometimes it cannot be too adaptive or helpful, and it can be a form of avoidance. And I think it's important to recognize, like, what's the function of this behavior? Like, why am I doing what I'm doing right now? Because in addition to you staying busy, I've also learned that you have written books and taught people and advocated for your community and for yourself and for your experience. That's also a form of healing, because as we all know, this stuff will probably stick around, just being realistic, and the trauma will stick around. And I think as you go through your life and you learn new things and you seek support, not only professionally, but I think I really want to emphasize the importance of seeking support through your community and through your loved ones. That's something that was found in my research to be very effective, because a lot of us experience guilt and stigma for not being able to put words to our emotions. We don't know how to talk to people about what happened. A lot of people don't know how to put words to their experiences. And I think one of the most effective ways is by joining conversations like this, joining private, safe conversations where you can just tell your story. That's also a form of healing. That's also a form of processing and getting through this, hearing what other people have gone through, seeing that you're not alone with your nightmares and with your re-experiencing symptoms and with your re-traumatization. You're not alone. All of us are going through this collectively. And if you can recognize that and see that, like, you're not alone in this, not just you, Senahid, but everyone on this call, I think that is one step toward this, because this is a very complex and tricky type of trauma to approach. It's not just one thing that happened in one period of time. It goes across the lifespan, and it doesn't just impact you, the ones who were directly impacted by it, but impacts us too, right? And how we navigate the world. And I think the more that we can be together, the more we can tell our stories and know when to consult and seek professional help. There is a massive stigma in our community for mental health. That's one of the main reasons why I got into this field. So we can show people, like our parents, our grandparents, the people who are alive to tell their stories, that you can do it at this level too. You can do it with a mental health professional who is trained to deal with grief and loss and trauma and know how to teach you to navigate these situations. With many patients that I've worked with, they have told me, Azra, Dr. O, I haven't been able to, like, talk to anyone about this. I don't even know how to put words to my experience. Like, I don't even know where to start. And with your help, we've been able to really, like, put structure to something that is so chaotic in the mind. That's why you have re-experiencing symptoms, because we can't parse apart exactly what happened. And I think the more that you can do that, seek community support, that could be cultural, religious, educational, it can be whatever. It can be through books, it can be through anything to connect you, and seek people like me and Dr. Shareef and other doctors out there. They don't even have to be Bosnian. They can be Americans who don't know, but they're trained to learn and to help you. And so I don't want you to just limit yourself to say, like, I don't want to see this person because they're not Bosnian or they don't know. I want you to give it a test try to see if it's a good fit, because you might be surprised. There are good trained professionals out there who don't identify as Muslim, who don't identify as Bosnian, that will be able to help you. And so the one thing I want to really stress to our community is use all the supports around you, because you have so many. You're not alone. You're not alone in this grief and this loss. We're all experiencing it together collectively. And I'm here for you. I'm here to discuss this and to continue this discussion even after today. So thank you so much. And I hope that answered some of it. I know that was a very long-winded answer, but that's my perspective as a child of people who were directly exposed to grief and loss, as a clinical psychologist, and just as a human being.
Dr. Osmančević, we have some very good questions from the audience. So Aida is going to now ask if you have a few more minutes. That would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, I did touch base with Azra, and thank you, Azra, for extending your time with us. Dr. Osmančević, thank you for extending your time with us. We really appreciate it. We do have a healthy number of questions, and I know we also have some from our survivors. Before I read off the questions, I do want to say, Senahid and Senada, thank you so much for sharing your stories. It really touched me deeply. Senahid hearing you earlier. So I think, like Dr. Osmančević mentioned, there is power in sharing our stories. And oftentimes, and thank you again for emphasizing, Dr. Osmančević, on the stigma on mental health and seeking help within our community that we haven't had a chance to really tackle and address. So this is really important. And again, emphasis on thank you. So we have quite a few questions. I'm going to start with Boaz Levy. Has there been any research, and this can be addressed by Dr. Shareef, Dr. Osmančević, or any other folks on our panel, has there been any research or exploration into approaching avoidance and healing by facilitating exchanges between Bosniaks and other communities which face collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, disconnection, and genocide denial? And also they thank us for sharing these important perspectives and insights today. So whoever would like to, and we do have 15 minutes and I want to be able to address it. So if my doctors can condense their answers, that would be lovely so we can get to all of the questions. Thank you.
I'll keep it short and sweet. Yes, there is research out there to show that approach and exchanges and talking about this stuff is effective and helpful. And I highly, highly recommend it wherever you feel safe to talk to people about your story and approach it versus pushing it away. That's my answer.
And I guess we can also add to that perhaps, I know I'm putting you on spot, both of you, but if anybody really would like to continue this conversation, perhaps we can try to reach out to our panelists and then maybe they'll direct you with more specifics.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for that. The first layer of that question is that has there been any research or exploration in it? So if there are, we can also send them out. Professor Kriještorac can, if we do identify any of the research associated with that, we're happy to send that out if Dr. Kriještorac or Professor Kriještorac has a way to link with our folks that are asking the questions in there. Next question was from Dennis.
Sorry, Aida, can I just add that perhaps that because I work for Rembering Srebrenica in UK, and I have found that our associations here have really stepped in. And they helped out, for instance, Ukrainian refugees or Syrian refugees. And they also found that because of the experience they had, they could actually kind of open up and they really felt like somebody actually understand what they had been through. So that it by itself was kind of helpful. And that's something that I have witnessed so many times. And I'm really grateful that, for once kind of bad experiences can be turned into positive, really.
That is a very good point. And it actually, Aida, ties to what Dr. Osmančević was saying earlier in different ways that we can have that, safe space, right? Is connecting with folks that have similar experiences enables us to open up about our own experiences, right? Thank you for sharing that. Is there any research on how genocide proponents use genocide denial as a psychological weapon to taunt, re-traumatize the victims and thus deepen and perpetuate the effects of genocide? Dr. Shareef, Dr. Osmančević, happy to hear from both of you.
I think this is a little bit too general question. Yes, there is Holocaust studies are very strong on this. They actually talk about stages of genocide, and they note that this is essentially a last stage of genocide. Now, it depends who you ask. Some people talk about 8 stages, some people talk about 10 stages. But in every research, they point that genocide denial is part of the process of genocide. And that's why I said in the beginning, it is a reminiscent of failure to protect the USA zone, is now failure to essentially witness on behalf of the victims. This is very important in the human rights regime, protection regime, to witness on behalf of those people who are traumatized. That's why we're doing this event today. But there is a research. If you look in the Holocaust and genocide studies, at FIU they have it, but perhaps other universities have it as well. You will find it.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very helpful. We have from Almir Karamović. He says, thank you all. He appreciates Senada's stake because it touches on the 3 generations of genocide denial. When this type of phenomenon is normalized and leads to revisionist history, like we have seen, how do we change the paradigm so that the aggressors stop. We have seen they will repeat it, they will repeat their actions. Professor, I think this would be a great question for you, if you have any insight.
We are doing it now.
Yeah.
This is what we're doing. We actually, that's why we're addressing the question. I myself have written a book about Bosniaks, and I am aware of the issues, and that's why we are now talking about it. And so this is one of the ways. We are trying to open this door. Hopefully, our religious leaders are listening, because religious institution, I'm sure that Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef will agree, and even our Professor Haliliović will agree, that there are essentially prime institutions for gathering, and they may be also very helpful in that way. But tonight, you want to say something, I guess?
Yeah, I'm not a politician, but as I told you, as a human being and someone who survived genocide, who is thinking every day about, who is listening what politicians do, what they say, etc., etc. By my opinion, to stop as much as possible denial of genocide is to defeat fascism. That is number one, because if fascism is definitely not defeated. So Milosevic was brought to the tribunal, and Karadzic and Mladic, they are in prison for life. But many of crimes, they are still on freedom. As a result of them idea in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not defeated; it's still alive. As a result of genocide and as a result of ethnically cleansed people, we got entities in Bosnia, especially entity Republika Srpska, and that is something what we have to think also other way how to, but it is not possible to stop when by Dayton agreement they got the right to say something. You see now some politicians in Bosnia, they say, oh, we are going to separate from Bosnia, or they are glorify crime people, and that is logically that they will deny genocide also.
Yeah,
that's my opinion.
I think this will be addressed with the next conversation in May. That so we'll be talking about that. But let's.
No, I'm sorry. I tried to answer the question.
No, this is very good. No, this is very, very good. Thank you so much, Senahid. We have about 9 more minutes, and I really want to get to the Q&A.
I think
Layla is with us.
Ms. Hughton wants to say something too.
Yes, of course.
Yes, I saw the question from Aida. She says, how can commemorations in diaspora benefit the grief process for our communities, especially for those people who cannot safely return to commemorate in their hometowns? And I can tell you that I've been commemorating at Srebrenica Memorial for the last 9 years in UK, together with thousands of UK people, mostly actually British people, to be honest, who wanted to learn, and we gave them the opportunity. But also I gave them opportunity to meet our culture, you know, our language, our food, to get to know the people, and then also to hear the stories. And I found that exactly that kind of human contact is one of the best ways forward, which ultimately led to me taking people across to Bosnia, you know. So I just hope that, you know, some of our people will eventually go home, because, you know, that is what we all want. We all want to be back to our own homes and all memories and all alleyways, really. So thank you for asking the question, Aida.
Excellent. Can I ask one more question, Aida, please?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, actually, to the commemoration answer, because I think it's very important that we talk a little bit about it. So Srebrenica UK has done an amazing job. One of the things that Dr. Osmančević was mentioning too is finding the pockets of communities, right? And how to ensure that that happens. And some of the ways in the US particularly, we have created coalitions such as Jedna BiH, right? The different organizations with their different missions and visions can actually come together as a coalition to do commemorations as such, and it has that powerful voice where no matter what we are doing in our own spheres with our own vision and our mission, from our own outlook, we can come together as coalition to form some of these pockets of community that are so vital in ensuring that we are seen, we have a safe space, and that we remember it. And one other thing that I want to recognize is that we do have Srebrenica, memorial that we recognize and we commemorate every July, but Senahid actually touched on something very important, where other areas of Bosnia have experienced, similar, if not, different ways of genocide that isn't quantified as genocide, right? And so we want to make sure that those areas and those experiences are not minimized and forgotten.
That is exactly what UK Srebrenica is doing as well. So I have just come back like a couple of weeks ago from Kriještorac and Preporod as well as Srebrenica Sarajevo. So that's the thing. I work with a lot of universities. The whole charity really works with a whole lot of academics, throughout researchers. There are different memorandums signed between the Potential Memorial Center. So there's a tremendous work that is being done here, and I think that something that we definitely need to relate and kind of exchange and kind of amplify everywhere, really.
So this is why it's good that we call this genocide against Bosniaks, because sometimes when we speak only of Srebrenica, we forgot that the most important element, that it was committed to people. But I just want to, because I'm afraid that Dr. Osmančević will leave us, and to also utilize Dr. Shareef while they're with us. I hope you heard our Senahid properly. You realize how he's trying to escape the trauma. He's trying to basically work himself into the ground, right? He's trying to make himself busy, which is a sure sign of the trauma, right? And so I am just wondering, are you guys working to prepare for the upcoming storm, because all these people will get too old to be too busy, right? So then they will be essentially feeling these things. So how are we going to help those survivors wherever they are, in the United States, UK, anywhere, where they get to the point where it cannot be too, they cannot kind of manage the trauma with busyness. So both of you, Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef, is there anything out there? I understand what you said, but I do think that there is an element of cultural specificity with this, which essentially someone like you can perhaps maybe deal with it slightly better than others.
Yes, most definitely. A Bosnian person, a Bosnian psychologist, therapist, doctor would understand Senahid and people like him a little bit better than maybe an American psychologist or therapist or doctor would. And that I don't want to shut out all those other options that we have, right? And I think your question also just hits on the other resources that we have outside of just psychology and psychiatry. This needs to be addressed on a community level. So bringing community members together to have healing within the community. Something that I learned from my advisor, who I want to give a shout out to, Dr. Beth Boyd. She is Native American, and her people have gone through so much. For hundreds of years, Native Americans have had genocide denial against them, and they are surviving through their community and connection with their community, through spiritual, ceremonial things, through just talking to people. And I think the way that Dr. Shareef and I can prepare for this is to really think about our own mental bandwidth of how much we can handle, right, when it comes to trauma and processing, and being able to consult with colleagues and being able to refer appropriately if we see that a case is not appropriate. So there are like logistical pieces to this and specifics to how to approach this. But I think if you can hit on the professional support and the community support, that is what will be needed for people like my parents and other people's parents. I think that answers Layla's question a little bit, where one thing that I think is super effective is to find help for yourself to process this as a child of a person who was traumatized, and how that intergenerational trauma carries, so that you know how to make space for your parents, so you know how to understand and empathize with them if they do want to avoid, if they do want to work themselves into the ground, because you can't force anyone to heal. Everyone's healing journey is their own time, and you can't force someone into processing trauma. And if right now what working is what works, then keep doing that. And when you're ready to open up about it, know that there's support for you. So I really want to normalize Senahid and other people's experiences and Layla's experience of like, what the heck do I do? Right? And how do I make space for this? So that's
wonderful. I'm so glad that you led me right into my next question, Dr. Osmančević, which thank you, Layla. We have with us Senada's daughter, Layla. Thank you for attending. She says, hello, I'm Senada's daughter. Hi, Mom. As a daughter of a war survivor, what does my role look like? How do I go about creating a space that's open to have these conversations so I can not only know more about my mom, but also know her trauma has affected her, the way I was raised, and how that trauma has played into who me and my brother are now? This is such a powerful question, and I can't wait to hear your answers, Dr. Osmančević and Dr. Shareef.
Like I mentioned, I think, being able to process this with someone who's not biased, Layla. So reaching out to a therapist or a psychologist to talk about what your experience is like as a child of a refugee from Bosnia, because our experiences, and I relate with you because I'm also you in this situation, are completely different than our parents, because we're the generation where our parents came to this country with nothing and we learned English faster. We went to school all the time. We developed the cultural norms faster. We had that biculturalism really come in quicker than our parents did. And that means we took on a lot. A lot of my research participants that I talked to, we had to talk on the phone. We had to attend certain doctor's appointments, go to the bank with people, do translating at very young ages. And that in itself is a completely different social experience that Dr. Shareef was speaking about that can be connected to intergenerational trauma. And I think processing that with not just like a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist, but with your friends. Me being able to talk to my Bosnian friends who are my age about our experience and normalizing it and being like, well, I'm not alone. Like we all went through this, and being able to see that we have a community together. And one way that I've really learned how to heal and to work through this is through my work and through my research, being able to look at this stuff from a different lens, not from a lens as just the child of a refugee, but the lens as a professional, the lens as a student, et cetera, et cetera. And another question that I see here that is really standing out to me is by Almir regarding like ethnic healing. And I think that's a wonderful question that I hope we get to talk about today, because in my generation, you really see that shift of people wanting to come together again and be united in our healing. So hopefully we can address that later, but that's my answer for Layla.
Dr. Shareef?
I mean, Dr. Azra pretty much covered most of what I was going to say. The only 2 cents that I would add to that is just the fact, Layla, that you even asked this question. The fact that you're minded towards, I am recognizing pain in my parents. I'm recognizing that there's something there that they're holding, and I'm not sure what it is, or I'm trying to understand what it is, or maybe on paper I know what it is, but I have no idea of like how deep this goes and how much it's affected them. The fact that you're even asking this, minded towards this, I think it's a beautiful thing. I mean, this is how you break a cycle of generational trauma, by first addressing that there is trauma and it is affecting my parents, and I can feel the effect myself too. I can't quantify it, I can't put my finger on it exactly what this is, I'm not sure, but something about, the red flag is up, something's here, and I want to have a conversation. I want to know, for this, a lot of anxiety and a lot of trauma is rooted in uncertainty. It's rooted in this unknown. It's rooted in darkness. It's rooted in a light not being shined on this. The best way to address a psychological crisis or a problem is to first have insight into recognizing that there is a psychological crisis and a problem here, and then taking steps to address it. The addressing part is what Dr. Azra had already covered beautifully, which is actually seeking help, seeking support, seeking help on a professional level, seeking help on a familial level, seeking help on a community level. the very act of dialogue and discussion breathes life into someone's trauma and someone's pain. There's a lot of potency and power in narrative therapy, being able to form and build your own narrative. And like Dr. Mirsad mentioned, and Dr. Senahid mentioned, there is an active campaign to rewrite that narrative, to disrupt that narrative, to craft a narrative into something different. So the potency in narrative therapy and being able to express pain, tell a story, and express yourself and have someone listen and acknowledge it isn't only just psychotherapeutic, isn't just therapeutic to do this. On a much grander level, it's an expression of self, it's an expression of identity, it's an expression of I have experienced this, we've all experienced this. You as my child are also experiencing this vicariously through me and my experience, and we are giving life and concrete reality to it. We're bringing this into reality. And so the best way to combat this kind of denialism, the best way to combat an invisible scar or an invisible pain is to make it visible, allow it to be visible. And that's, for a lot of families, this is a very, very difficult thing. The question you're asking, so many children of victims don't have this, don't grasp this, and don't see it. For them, it's conflict between them and their parents. It's this understanding of like, I don't get why my parents are like this. I don't understand why my parents are so intense, or why my parents are so like, you know, hardcore about this. Or I don't get why my parents seem so aloof, or my parents seem so distant. I don't get why love in our family feels like.
But you know, I have to tell you something. You know, we have a lot of very, very esteemed guests in the program. Like I see Dr. Zwingo is with us. My dear mentor, right? Dr. Misbahi is here, the director of the Muslim World Studies Center, and he brings a very important dimension. Essentially, who has a right to essentially be recognized as a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying basically it's important to remember the global dimension. So now, can Muslims feel victims nowadays? That's what he's saying. That's why that international relations or global dimension to all these discussions is important indeed. And thank you, Dr. Misbahi, for that comment. But Professor Mediha from Chicago, is also, she asked you specifically a question. You said that healing the trauma on your own is difficult. And so she said, can you elaborate? Why is it difficult to do it on your own? And please be brief, because Aida already indicated to me that we are breaking the time.
So I did type a response to Dr. Mediha. I wasn't sure if we're going to get to that question yet, but I mean, I don't mind reiterating that. But Dr. Azra, if you want to jump in first, answering the question, you certainly can.
You can go ahead, Dr. Shareef.
Okay, sure. So Mediha, I just wanted to thank you for asking that. The gist of basically what I said was my understanding and my belief is that it is certainly possible to process a trauma yourself, individually, alone. I'm not saying that it's not doable at all. What I mentioned is that it's very difficult to do this. Certainly doable, but very difficult. And oftentimes I like to equate it to this analogy of you slip outside, you fall, and like you break your arm and your bone is out of place. And so what you can do is you can leave your arm exactly as is and just go the rest of your life like that without ever seeking help, care, or support for it. Essentially what your body will do, naturally speaking, is that the bone will heal, your arm will heal, but it will heal crooked. It will heal disjointed. It's going to heal in an awkward way, and then it solidifies at that point, almost like it crystallizes. Like the bone hardens this way. You almost become hardwired that this is how I coped. This is how I like manage my trauma. I've been doing this for years. I've always been doing this. This is my way. This is how I've done it. And so there's a rigidity to that. And so in the future, when you have someone with like a crooked arm, the only way to heal that arm again, honestly speaking, is to confront a very serious trauma, in this case, a physical trauma, put the bone back into its proper place. And then just like we do in proper healing, you put a splint, a cast, painkillers, physical therapy, you go through the arduous work of actually healing properly so that your arm is functional again. So if I take the arm example and replace your arm with your mind, same example, where you suffer a trauma and the trauma inflicts a psychological wound on your mind, you can certainly do it alone. You can certainly process this and heal from this by yourself, privately, on your own. But that wound and that scar is invisible. No one else around you sees it, knows it, recognizes it. You certainly do because you feel it, but it's invisible to everyone else. And the problem with this is that even if you do recover, the recovery could be something where it leaves scarring. It leaves residual trauma. It leaves residual pain. Like Dr. Azra mentioned, generational effects for this. Affects 10, 20, 30 years down the line, you're still reeling from something because you haven't properly fully gotten help and treatment for it. So this is why it's very difficult to do this privately, individually. I don't recommend this. The recommendation that I have, Dr. Azra have, is to express, to share, to open, to let it out, let it out. Don't allow your mind to be a prison from within which you are torturing yourself. Don't allow yourself to do this. You've gone through enough trauma already. You don't need to suffer in silence. You don't need to suffer alone anymore. There is a collective understanding that all of us, every single one of us, are children of trauma. In whatever way, shape, or form that we have, we are all collectively part of that.
Thank you,
We're
Dr.
part of
Shareef.
the collective human pain of that. So please, please, what I would recommend, Mediha, to you and to anyone that you may be asking for, open and express.
Thank you, Dr. Shareef. I don't mean to cut you short,
Oh,
but
no.
I know we are over time, and I want to make sure that we are respectful of everyone's time, since we're 10 minutes over. We do have additional questions. So if folks are okay staying for maybe one or two more, there's some great questions that Aida, my co-moderator, had pointed out that is actually really, really important. So if our doctors are okay to stay on for maybe an additional 5 minutes, again, this has been an amazing discussion, very fruitful discussion, but also we want to, emphasize that we are a little bit over time. So Aida, if you want to just close us out with an additional couple questions, and then we will move along.
Yes, sure. I have briefly answered in anyway to Almir, but I just wanted to talk from my experiences again. So Almir was asking about regarding community. Have you seen inter-community healing? For example, Croatian, Serbian, and Bosnian communities coming together to discuss and form support for one another. Again, on my memorials from day one, I have second generation Serb and third generation her daughter who have been helping me cooking Bosnian food. And just kind of showing what kind of that spirit of Yugoslavia was. Which is amazing, So, and also when I was just in Prijedor a couple of weeks ago, I was told as well that in Prijedor, when it's the White Armband Day, there's a lot of the Serbs who actually are helping that whole process. So I would like to think it's yes, but I guess I'm sure some positive examples there. Any comments from yourselves?
Let's ask Senada. Senada is the question. Senada, please.
My question is kind of long, so I would rather leave it for later to respect everybody's time. Just next time. Yeah, it's gonna take too long to answer. I really appreciate it, but
Okay, and I also would like everybody to notice that Senada mentioned how she went to State Department a couple of weeks ago and spoke about this particular problem with as highest level of our government in the United States, essentially letting them know that that the issue of genocide denial, we take it very seriously. So thank you, Senada, for that.
you're welcome. Anytime. They know my name.
So we have one more question, I believe, from Renat. Many perpetrators of genocide and war in Bosnia still live in peace and quiet throughout the world, including Greece, Serbia, Russia, United States. We also know that here. The political will to go after them is winding down or was never there to begin with. It is a huge injustice, putting more fuel to the trauma. How should one deal with that, and what can be done to rectify it? Actually, Renat, I'm glad you asked this question. The next panel is going to be on political nuances of genocide denial, where we're going to have political scientists, journalists also join us. So look out.
Perhaps you should invite Dr. Shaikudinov himself. He also is a professor.
Oh,
He
wonderful.
writes about it, so he can perhaps maybe be the guest himself.
Yes, Professor, that would be wonderful. But if any of our panel experts want to briefly touch on that, that would be wonderful as well.
I will say from a psychological perspective, what we can do is advocacy. And that can look different in different stages. It could be teaching your coworkers about what happened to you. It could be teaching your neighbors who know nothing about Bosnia. It could be speaking in panels like this, doing research, writing books, anything related to keeping the story alive, because we know a part of genocide denial is to shut that out and to turn it off. And a part of psychological healing, like Dr. Shareef and I have said, is telling your story. And you can tell your story through advocacy. And we see that happen in different populations who have gone through the similar things to what we've gone through. Their stories never die because they keep talking about them. They don't stop. And that is an approach to psychological healing. And the more that we can do this, I think the better it'll be for our community as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a part of the perpetuation of this trauma is the fact that there isn't resolution to this trauma. So a lot of this is something where I liken it to, for example, if someone is the victim of like a sexual assault or a rape, and their rapist faces absolutely no repercussion. There's no repercussions for it. They're actually still out and about and doing their thing. And so every single moment that this perpetrator is out and about living life normally and casually is a re-traumatization. It is a perpetual re-traumatization of this. And so I need to acknowledge that first and foremost, that yes, this is a trauma. Yes, this adds more fuel to it. Absolutely. The recourse for this, like Dr. Azra mentioned, is that there is a lot we can do, narratively speaking, engagement speaking, community support, community awareness, within our own communities, awareness and support and understanding. Just like Dr. Mirsad said, just even this event alone is an act of ensuring that there's a voice and there's power and there's a narrative here that we are holding tightly to. One of the biggest comforts that I usually like confiding is in Surah Ibrahim in the Quran, chapter 14, verse 42, where Allah says, don't think that Allah is unaware of what the oppressors do. He only grants them respite until the day in which their eyes will stare in horror. And so this ayah makes it very clear that even though this pain may feel invisible to you, don't ever lose hope that this pain is not unknown. This pain is like erased. It's not. The entire point and purpose of an oppressor is to erase the evidence that they are an oppressor. So the most important thing we can do is to continue that narrative, make sure to keep it alive, and don't ever lose hope and faith that Allah is not aware of this, or does not know this, or has forgotten this. So there's a strength you can draw from your spiritualism, a strength you can draw from your community, from your social connections, a strength you can draw just within your own psychological fortitude and resilience, and a strength you can draw physically with your own body to strengthen yourself as a person in terms of your emotional and physical resolve in the face of continuous erasure of your narrative.
And I just want to add one last very final brief thought. After everything that Dr. Shareef and I have said, if those things are too hard to do and you feel like you don't have the capacity to do any of those things, some days just surviving is enough. Just living and surviving and being a human being in your body who has gone through these experiences, that is enough. You don't have to seek support. You don't have to do advocacy. You don't have to do any of that. Some days it's just surviving and getting to the next day, and that's enough. So I want you to remember that rest is also healing and is also productive, and that you don't have to constantly be working, because we're not made to do that. So I really want to emphasize that for everyone that's attended today, because all the other things we've said can be very hard depending on like where you're at in your stage of healing. And it's easy for us doctors to talk about it because we do it every day. And I really want to normalize for the everyday person that just surviving is enough.
Thank you, Dr. Azra. That was beautifully put.
If I can just
Here
say,
comes the sun. Here comes the sun. Yeah.
yeah, I could resonate with all of your words, and I wanted to say that it was like an eye-opener for me as well. I do a lot, I talk a lot, you know, it's a fighting mechanism, I guess, just like Senadas and Senahids, you know, we do a lot, but I'm so glad you said that, Dr. Osmančević, that rest is, some days surviving is enough. And yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you, everyone. Like I said, we are 20 minutes over. This has been an amazingly fruitful discussion, and it's not our last one. I am so happy to see such an engaged panel. I'm happy to see so many folks joining us via Facebook Live as well here. I want to give a major thank you and a high level of gratitude to our survivors. Senada, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Thank you for allowing your vulnerability to come out in this space. And for us to be able to connect with you and your daughter. Thank you, Layla, for joining today's discussion. Thank you for being interactive. Also, thank you so much to Senahid for sharing your story, for sharing your experience and everyday experience that you still currently live through. Thank you so much to our doctors and our experts, Dr. Omar Shareef. Thank you so much to Dr. Azra Osmančević, and we are very grateful to have someone who can actually relate to our everyday lived experiences and have a field that emphasizes on PTSD, on trauma, and how our community can heal. So your input and your being in this space is of immense value. So thank you for that. Thank you for Aida. Thank you, Professor Kriještorac, for creating this space of inclusivity for all of us to be able to come together with different organizations and really tackle the great issue that we are faced with in terms of genocide denial. With that, I want to leave it off to Professor Kriještorac for closing remarks. And I'm very grateful to have shared the space with you all and continue to share community with everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you also all for being with us today. All those of you who know me know that I'm a very big believer in human agency. And I'm also a believer in community education, not necessarily public education, but community education, which means let's talk with the community about things the community wants to talk versus, some other ways of doing this. And I appreciate all our attendees. As I said, very much appreciate Dr. Mizrahi, who made an excellent comment, Dr. Ringo, Dr. Shaikh Bedinov, Consul, Turkish Council joining us from Turkey, and everybody else who were there today. Thank you. We did important job. We witnessed on behalf of the victims and survivors. That's an important step in human rights protection. And I hope we will continue this conversation. I think we will shortly after this start disseminating information about the next event in May, right? Aida will be hosting that one with United BiH, right? We'll be hosting this conversation, and then we will basically lead this into July, where we will hopefully have a central program, perhaps in Chicago, I believe in the Holocaust Center, where BAGI will be hosting that one in July. And so we will do our part to keep this story alive and show that this is not something we'll drop down. But most importantly, like Aida, like Dr. Osmančević finished with a strong words, I want to also tell you the whole purpose of this, as far as I'm concerned, was to show everybody that we understand the game. We understand, the process, we understand the problem, and we will be dealing with it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
All the
you.
best.